Here we go. Okay. So we've run a number of these Infoshare sessions. There's a series of 4 Infoshares around open science. So we've already covered a general introduction to open science, and Irina Kuchma spoke in the last session around open access. We're now going to address fair data, because that's one of the key components of EOSC, how we make data fair. We have a couple of speakers, Françoise Genova. Let me just mute. There we go. Françoise Genova, who's been involved in the Turning Fair into Reality report and is currently the co-chair of the EOSC Fair Working Group. So she's going to give us an introduction to the FAIR principles and also look at how they're applied within one community in astronomy. And then Anders is going to speak about the work that's been done by DeiC to give us an NREN perspective on how you can support FAIR and look at the project that's been done there and get some inspiration on things you may do in your own contexts. So we have an hour and a half. I think the presentations will probably take between 45 minutes to an hour. I'm happy for people to raise questions in chat as we go along, and I can pick those up with the speakers after the talks. But we also have time to have like more of a discussion at the end as well. So if there are particular things you want to know more about, or if there are things we want to kind of brainstorm about how NREN support FAIR and open science, we can certainly do that too. So I will hand over to Françoise to give us the first introduction.
Thank you, Sarah. So now it has to start. And to begin to, voila.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you for the invitation. So the idea is to start from the FAIR concepts and implementation. I guess there are probably things you know very well in the talk, but it's not bad to have a summary of these things. So of course, the summary will begin with the FAIR guiding principles themselves. You see that things should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And the principles tell you what it means, basically. If you look at them in detail, it's not so evident, because if you are told data are described with rich metadata, what rich means can be a matter of very long discussions. And there are a certain number of things which are being discussed, the same thing for vocabularies following the FAIR principles, what does it really mean, and so on. So there can be lots of discussions about the details of the principles, but they are really meaningful, because find, access, interoperate, and reuse data is at the core of what scientists in particular, but not only them, do with data or should be able to do with data. So the beginning of the talk will be about FAIR in general, and then I will show you, using the expertise I have myself, because I am an astronomer, what we do with data in astronomy, just to show you it's worth doing the effort to follow the FAIR principles. It requires lots of work, but it's really worth, and I would like you to see how it can work. So the FAIR principles here, it tells you where it comes from. They were published in 2016 in a paper, and there was an absolutely immediate take-up. I think nearly all the people who signed the initial paper are from the life science community, but they were really in the mood of the fact that everybody was beginning to think seriously about open science and so on. And so there was an immediate take-up of the principles. The point is that fairness does not begin with the FAIR principles. It began long before. And open science was very high on the political agenda already when the FAIR principles were published. And I think that at the political level, this could be, we could cite the OECD report in 2007, which is about access to research data from public funding. The OECD is working on an update of this report, which should be published at the beginning of next year somehow. So it will be interesting to see what they say, taking into account what happened since 2007. And I did not reproduce the principles and guidelines in this slide, but there was a long list of principles which are important for accessing research data from public funding. And these keywords are still important, of course. Then, much closer to us in 2013, there was a very strong declaration of the G8 science ministers in a meeting which was in Great Britain. And there are fewer words, but as a practitioner of data sharing, I can buy any of them for myself. And I think they are all very important. Discoverable, accessible, accessible, intelligible, usable, and wherever possible, interoperable to specific quality standards. All these words are important. If you think about the FAIR principles, having for instance, the declaration of 2013 in mind, you will realize immediately that FAIR is an extremely efficient way to name something which had been existing for a while in some communities, but which is also meaningful for everybody, or should be meaningful for all communities, basically. So just to illustrate that things were taken up very quickly, the principles were published in 2016, and then the European Commission mandated a group of people, of which Sarah was the rapporteur, if I remember well, and Simon Hodson, the president, and I was a member of that group. We were tasked to understand what it means to implement fairness somehow, what it means to be fair and what it means to make it happen. So we made a first report and we were asked to do an action plan with recommendations. The report is really, I think it's still very useful and it still holds after 2 years and many things which happened since then. It covers many aspects, concept, the evolution of research culture, technical ecosystem, skills, metrics, sustainable and strategic funding, and finishes with recommendation and actions. And so here are the recommendation and actions. It may be a bit difficult to read, but they are several pillars which are ordered along a timeline. You have to define FAIR, then to implement it, and then to embed it in the global system and to sustain it. If you go into the details, you will see the title of each recommendation, and I will illustrate one in a minute. And each recommendation comes with sub-recommendations, and each of them comes with stakeholders. And I think that having the stakeholders explicitly listed is also important, because if you are a policymaker, you know where to look at if you want to focus on what you have to do, or if you have a research organization and so on. So all this is, I think, really still useful. Another thing, one of the many things which is written in the report is this, which is to say that FAIR is not only data. FAIR is a full ecosystem which has several aspects. So there is data which is in repositories. There are standards, identifiers, data management plans, policies, and we need to develop registries. So if you think about all that, you will see that some things are well defined, some things are already listed in registries, but by far not everything. And so this system is being built currently, and we have to understand how to build it properly as an ecosystem and not as a set of things which are piled up here and there. So if I take one of the recommendations, if I go back, no. If I go back, it's just to show you where it is in the schema. In the general schema, it's here, incentives and metrics for fair data and services. It's in embed and sustain. So there was this recommendation. about developing metrics for fair digital objects. And so it was taken seriously. One of the sub-recommendations was that the European Commission had to do something about metrics. And something happened, and a working group of the RDA worked to develop a fair data maturity model, which has 41 criteria, which are here to tell you what it means to be fair and what it means, what the guiding principles mean in practice. They also put priorities on the criteria essential, important, and useful. We also had in the EOSC Fair Working Group, we were tasked to write recommendations on fair metrics. And so there is a second draft which has been opened for comments. And there will be, the final version will be published soon, I guess. And there is also interesting information about FAIR and how FAIR is implemented in communities in another report of the FAIR Working Group, which is called 6 Recommendations on Implementation of FAIR Practices. So there are links, I guess the slides are available and you can use the links anyway. So if I go to the report we have written on recommendations on defining metrics frameworks, it's the next version after the draft which was proposed for comments, and it's very close to a final version. So we are not only proposing the metrics for EOSC, but we are also making recommendations on when to take into account when defining metrics frameworks. So we insist on the fact that there is, one of the reasons to have this is that there are lots of concerns in the communities. We knew that before we began to write the report, but this was completely confirmed when preliminary priorities were submitted for comments by the community during the summer, by the EOSC Secretariat and Executive Board, basically. And there were many concerns about metrics expressed by the community. So it's very important to be cautious when one defines metrics. And so this is why we also think that having recommendations is important. So we think that this should be a continuous process and that it is essential to take feedback from implementation into account, because metrics can be extremely dangerous if they are not fit for purpose, and they can have very bad consequences. So feedback from implementation is key in that. Inclusiveness is also extremely important. Do not reinvent the wheel. When you have evaluation methods, they have to be thoroughly assessed in many different contexts before they are used, especially if they are used to throw away things. We also say, and we are not the only ones to say that fair metrics should be developed for digital objects which are not only data, in particular for software and others. There is a what is a fair vocabulary, for instance, that guidance should be provided, and that we have to be very careful not to mandate generic cross-domain usage, but to develop it on a pragmatic way based on use cases. So one of the things we are very conscious of is the importance of communities. And it's not that we are conscious of it, it's that the communities are really important when one discusses FAIR. What we found about the RDA FAIR data maturity model when we wrote the report is that it's a very good toolbox. It's linked to do not reinvent the wheel, but it's also that the model is a good toolbox. And the idea is to use it and to provide feedbacks from the usage, but also to take into account the context and the aims, the specific use case. So we have these recommendations as a result of the exercise that there is, sorry, So this is not our recommendation. Sorry, I should have written it better. It's the sixth recommendation to the EOSC decision-making entities, which are written in the relevant report from the FAIR working group. So you see, there is a need to have community-specific support, awareness rising about FAIR, training, education, and community-specific support. The report explains that FAIR practices are very different and that each community has to understand what it means for itself to have FAIR data and to have FAIR practices. So in this case, there is lots of work to do at the community level. Then when these things are done, awareness rising in particular, there is a need to fund development, adoption, and maintenance of community standards, tools, and infrastructures, just to make people able to do FAIR for their own needs. There is a need to do this with governance at the community level, so it's the third one. Then we find the guidelines for other digital objects, reward and recognitions. Of course, this is a key for open science in general to develop. And there is a need for policies also. So these are things which are linked to the general context. I don't think we can go in more details, but I just would like to show you an example of FAIR practices in astronomy. So I think in astronomy, we developed FAIR practices because for us, sharing data and being able to discover, reuse, and interoperate it is really at the core of a disciplinary science process. Because we need data from different instruments to understand what happens in the objects we see in the sky, in the universe in general, and also because there is temporal variability on many time scales and spatial scales, and to study it, you need to use different instruments at different moments in history even. There is also something which is more on the taxpayer side, reuse data observed from costly facilities. And we have many kinds of data resources which are available openly online. The archives of the observatories, very large surveys, billions of objects which are observed homogeneously in the sky, added value data services. We can consider that journals are also data resources, and we take care of data attached to papers and also modeling data. So if you think about research infrastructures in astronomy, you certainly think about the telescopes on the mountains or elsewhere, and the sky telescopes also. But the practice, the everyday practice of astronomers is that there is data infrastructure which is global, and this is another infrastructure people are using. And it's not like having time on a telescope from time to time. It's something people use every day in their science practice, the data infrastructure, the data which is available. So it has been a very long history. The first satellite, I think, to have an open database was IUE, and it was already much in use before the end of the satellite life. And the data center, which is in Strasbourg, which is added value data, it began very, very long ago, in 1972. What we learned building the way we share data is that it's really all about standards. And it was probably easier for us because we have been accustomed to work at the international level to build instruments. And so it helps to know how to do it, to be able to discuss standards. So the first standard is the format, which is the basis of everything, which was published in 1979. And it's also extremely important because it integrates the metadata you need about the observation. So you are able to reuse the data fully using FITS. Then in 2002, we built something which is called the International Virtual Observatory Alliance, which was built up to define the standards to discover, access, and interoperate data. So we say discover, not find, but it's FAI. What we built along this year is an open and fully inclusive international framework, and there are standards defined by the IVOA and tools to use the data which are using the standards. So everything is open. Data producers have taken up the framework, and we have more than 100 authorities to provide a resource, which provide a resource in the virtual observatory, and it includes all the large data providers, ground-based telescopes, space agencies, and so on. And one thing we found from the beginning, and it worked, it's because we think and we found and we confirmed that it is essential that the framework development is driven by science needs. So the result of all this is that we use the data we retrieve online every day, basically. So this is a scheme of the virtual observatory architecture. You see that we find, we access, we reuse, and we interoperate data. On the top, you have either people or machines using the data and accessing it. And on the bottom, you have the data providers. Of course, to get all this, there are standards, and this is the hidden part of the virtual observatory. The users don't see it, but we build it by agreeing on standards and implementing them. If you have a view, just to show you how it works, it's one of the applications, it's called Aladdin. And there is a registry of resources. There are data from many observatories and missions, all sky data sets, many, large catalogs, very large catalogs, including, I think, the third release of Gaia catalog is today, so it's billion of objects. Way to do complex queries, multi-resolution techniques, interoperability between data and applications, which is very important. So applications can talk to each other seamlessly. And so you can go from an image to a spectrum and other things seamlessly, including notebooks, because many people use them now. So just to show you the impact, this is the papers published with data from the Hubble Space Telescope. And what is in blue is the people who got observation time for their own team on the telescope. So it's the papers they publish as a result of this, using these observations. Above it, you have the data, the papers which are published with data from the archive alone, and above it, both the data from the archive and data obtained by the team which publishes the paper. So you see, if you are in infrastructure, it's very good for you to be available in an interoperability framework, which allows everybody to use your data for many purposes, different from the original ones, because you do more than doubling your publications linked to your infrastructure. So this is the conclusion. We have a system which is combined with open access policies after a proprietary period. So this means wherever people are, they have access to the best data and tools. Even if you are in a remote region, you just need to have internet, but if you are internet, you are at the same level as the others in terms of the data and tools. We have a disciplinary flavor of FAIR. We find using sky coordinates, for instance, or the observation wavelengths, or many other things rather than the persistent ID. We have openness based on disciplinary ethics, not always on licenses. We have interoperability and reusable as main aims, and we use findable and accessible to reach that aim. We are okay with the RDA criteria, but we have our own evaluation of priorities. And we have the ESCAPE cluster is working on interfacing the VO framework with the EOSC, keeping the capabilities we have enabled by the VO. Thank you. I don't see any question.
Sorry, I'm just trying to find the mute button. No, not yet, but I think a lot of the things you touched on there are really relevant to the group. So the fact that FAIR isn't really something new, I think they've found a very catchy acronym. But when you look at practice that's been going on in many research communities, astronomy and others, it shows that there's a lot of kind of legacy to this, and certainly with earlier principles like OECD and others. And I think one of the things, as you said, that's come out strongly from our group, this need to think about the disciplinary practice and also to be pragmatic. So this point came up the other day in the EIRG session, that we're not doing interoperability for, without having a clear use case. You have to think about what data is relevant to combine, where there's actually going to be a practical application. And then you can actually, identify those mappings between the different standards or the different communities. And I think we need to think at that practical level. It gives you a context in which you can apply interoperability. So I'm just going to check if anyone has questions that they want to raise to Françoise before we move on. By all means, unmute or pop in chat. But I think hopefully this has given you a sense of what FAIR means. I'm actually going to ask, I don't know if people are willing to raise hands or vote somehow, but are people familiar with the principles already? Does this, did you have a sense of what this meant before we started? Yes, from Wayne, from Sylvia. So I think there's some awareness already of what FAIR is, but I think that example from astronomy shows exactly, the different levels of standards that you need. So on the formats, on the metadata, the understandings of which data can be shared under what kind of license. Excellent. Okay. Well, I will hand. Yeah,
sorry,
go ahead.
Sorry, just something that what I was interested in is the relying on kind of disciplinary kind of ethics rather than licenses to release the data. I was wondering how that works in practice.
Oh, Françoise, you're muted.
It works well in astronomy because there is not so much commercial aspects, although there are people who develop tools for the amateur astronomers and so on. So it works rather well, and to say the truth, we began to share data before the Creative Commons was created. So the licensing story is a bit younger than our exchange of data. So basically, you find licenses in the observatory archives and so on. So it's not unheard of, but it's true that the basic of what we do is that things are open after a proprietary period for the people who win the observation time for that observational data, and it works. And this means that the ethics is that people are supposed to cite the origin of the data. It's not always done, but it's mostly done. So it's also a reward for the people who provide the data, because what they do is cited in papers, and their own papers are cited. So I think that the system works, basically. Even if there are people who do not play the game properly, it works. If you put a barrier saying there is a license and you have to read it before doing anything, in this case, all this is seamless. So it's seamless and people expect they can use the data and they behave mostly properly. But I know that every time I say that, there are people who tell me that no one should use our data because without a license, you are not allowed to use anything. So I know that very well. Thank you.
No, thanks.
Yeah, I think there's that technicality, isn't there, that you should have a license to make it explicit, but in certain communities, the practice, it's just commonplace and it's known that something's open. And
I think that, of course, we need to put licenses everywhere because this is expected. But again, we practically, in practice, having things which are open, it really helps things to be reused, to tell you the truth.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of good examples of that, like the Landsat satellite imagery data that
Yes.
came, I think that was presented at one of the RDA conferences. And yeah, the amount, once that was made open, the amount of reuse and also the kind of economic benefits it generated, because there's all these new businesses that set up around reusing that data. So there's a huge benefit to being open.
Yes, and I see a comment by Chris, the fact that the Vatican Library is using FITS. Yes, I know, I was surprised too. But you know, the usage of the interest of FITS is that it clearly includes data and metadata. So this means that data cannot move without the metadata, you need to reuse it. And I know that in FAIR, some people say you have to separate both, but I will refuse to do it.
Yeah.
Because this means data many years after it's obtained, if you keep the original data somewhere, you have the metadata with it built in. So it's one of the advantages of it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point actually. So with the FAIR principles, I mean, they are quite flexible, but there are aspects like whether the metadata and the data are separate and have persistent identifiers individually, or whether it's one object that's like a composite object. And different communities have different practices, so we can't, you know, within the context of EOSC or any other context, we can't enforce one method over another. And this is something that's repeatedly come out when we've looked at the metrics, when we've looked at our fair practice report, the PID policy. We've had to keep it very open and flexible because there are differences. I've always also been a fan of trying to put the data and the metadata together. So my early work had been in cultural heritage, looking at things like digitizing objects, and you would always have the TIFF header. You'd make sure that the metadata's there with the object, because if you lose that label, you know yourself, if you have a tin in a cupboard and the label comes off for whatever reason, you have no sense of what it is. So I think trying to keep things sticky and together is actually a huge benefit. And it's nice to see standards being reused. It shows the benefits rather than everyone making up their own new standard, seeing that FITS has applicability in other contexts.
It's maybe because, you know, there are astronomers at the Vatican.
Probably, yeah.
They are the Jesuits, the observatory of the Vatican. They have a historical observatory, and they have observations in the US somewhere. And maybe this was a discussion between the priests which are working in the library and the priests which are working in the observatory. I don't know.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, so thank you very much, Françoise. If we hand over to Anders now, we'll get an example of what's happened in one of the NRENs and how you potentially could support FAIR and develop resources.
I can't help from just commenting on FITS to begin with, since we did a sort of preservation project with astronomers from Aarhus University about the Kepler data and their related products, and the Danish National Archive wanted to preserve them, but unfortunately they were not able to handle FITS format, so that didn't happen. So it's not everybody who is able to. I think FITS was fine, fit for purpose. Anyways, I was supposed to speak from a different angle, from more how we have been dealing with FAIR at DeiC, and definitely you will see some of the perspectives that Françoise has mentioned. Both as scientific, is always wonderful to see how astronomy has been doing, and that's definitely a big inspiration for us, how communities like astronomy has been taking these initiatives, and that's in a way the inspiration for how we can build broader support for FAIR uptake. We will also see inspiration from the reports and other work mentioned by Françoise. Possibly you know what DeiC is, Danish Infrastructure Corporation. And yes, we are an NREN running the Danish research networks. You might wonder why this is a topic for us. But we do a number of other things than the research network. We do national collaboration on high performance computing, and we do research data management. So to look a little bit of the history, and then I'll cover some strategic aspects, why we are in this and what we're doing, both historically and in the future, and then I'll show you some of the results that have been done concretely. So first, we had for 4 or 5 years, we had this thing called National Forum for Research Data Management. There was a national strategy for 2015 to 18 agreed by universities and preservation institutions. And there was funding for common projects. There was a really successful train-the-trainer program and knowledge sharing through meetings and mailing lists, etc. And this forum had secretarial assistance from DeiC. So this DeiC was one of the partners behind this strategy, and DeiC put both assistance in it and also funding for a number of infrastructure pilot projects. So this was the background how DeiC entered into data management. And then obviously after 2018, this strategy expired, and there's now a broad e-infrastructure strategy in Denmark that's chaired by the ministry and with all the universities as parties. And that has defined DeiC as a sort of, to speak, executive body for this strategy, and defining the 3 future pillars, which are still networking, HPC, and data management. And the ownership of DeiC has changed from being connected to the Agency for Research and Education to being, it's in the process of being owned by universities, but already since 2018, the board consists of university senior managers. And likewise, there will be increased funding, or there already has been since this year. Both universities and the ministry is putting in a significantly increased amount of money into both HPC and data management. So then moving on to FAIR, because in this Research Data Management Forum that started 2015, the interest turned almost immediately in the direction of FAIR after the FAIR principles were known. First they were published, and I think they became widely known in the beginning of end of 2016 or beginning of 17. And immediately people started thinking of how to integrate FAIR in existing projects. And in 2018, they made the first real FAIR project called FAIR Across. I don't really know if that translates well, but it meant across all the disciplines. So it was, for the first time, started exploring with interviews with researchers in a number of different fields, and by making data pilots, seeing how do these principles translate into different disciplines. What are the challenges when you want to make your data fair in archaeology or social science or particle physics or whatever. And it produced a number of things to sort of help overcome some of the obstacles. It defined a toolbox of different tools for parts of the research life cycle, which is a way to regard research in phases of planning, executing, analyzing, publishing, etc. And you can see data likewise in a data life cycle. So this life cycle concept is often used in research data management. And finally, they made a workshop and an international conference where I indeed believe Sarah was one of the speakers. So that was the first real larger scale FAIR project. Then some people made an e-learning course that included a module on FAIR. In 2019, we became more specifically addressing what is sometimes called verification, which means making research data fair. So in the humanities, there was a group of people setting up 7 practical cases where some research data became more fair. And in DeiC, we worked with a Danish part of an ESFRI project called RDA, which is based in earth sciences, and they study a lot of environmental phenomena, and they have some time series of meteorological data that they wanted to make available in a fair manner. So we started producing some sort of pilot data sets from 3 different universities, which are all part of this ESFRI. Further on, one of the issues that Françoise did not specifically mention, but which is part of the turning FAIR into reality and almost any report on FAIR, is how to support the researchers with appropriate knowledge about data in their scientific fields. And that's commonly talked about data stewardship, and indeed people talk of a new profession of data stewards, not only in research, but also across industry and other sectors. So there has been this discussion, how do we educate data stewards enough? And should it be a 1-year, 2-year, 3-year university degree? Which level of competence should it be, etc. So we had a project group researching a lot about this, and they made and for the universities in Denmark, the question was, in a way, should we compete about this, see who can make the most relevant education, or should we coordinate and cooperate? And I don't think there was a clear answer, and I think the first university education has been accredited and will start next year, and there's another one in the coming, but at least we got this on the agenda, and they made a very thorough report that I put a link here in case any of you would be interested or know somebody who is interested in this topic. Further along this, we made a 5-day data stewardship training with people from GoFair, and the e-learning people made another big e-learning course specifically on FAIR that I'll show you a little more about. Finally, this year we had a metadata for machine workshop that I'll also come back to, that we are planning to continue developing next year. So turning to showing you some of the results. What this project FAIR Across made, they just talked to the researchers, found out what are the pain points, what are the obstacles, what are their objections to FAIR, and they, in a mostly humorous way, did a number of products to make this little booklet called A Fairy Tale. I could just show you if I can find, I think it's this window. Can you see it now? Does it come up? No?
It's showing like breaking news, BBC.
Well, it should.
Headlines stuff.
Okay, so just a moment, then we'll just click the link.
It might be picking up a second screen, maybe.
Yeah.
Here we go. Yeah, we got the fairy tale on.
Yeah, well, yeah. I tried to make it go to another window, but it didn't seem to want. I think I probably have it here.
Yeah, downloaded.
There you go. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is in a print format. If I make it bigger, and you can see it's kind of a fairy tale about Prince Fairhair wanting to marry my fair lady, and he has a lot of elves that are sent on expeditions to help that endeavor, and they face a number of challenges, and indeed each of the challenges related to one of the FAIR principles that Françoise had on her first slide. So first findable, etc. There's one little story for each of the FAIR principles that you can read if you want a kind of light-hearted way to enter this world. Now it doesn't want to go back to my, how do I now get it? Okay, it's because I made it. I think
yeah, if you escape from that, hopefully it might be behind.
I think it's not, yeah, back to the slide
or
now.
Minimize, yeah.
Yeah, I just had to make it not full screen. And this is also on a web, it has a website. So if this has been very, very popular, we printed many copies of this and distributed. All the other resources for that project you can find on a special web page. One of them being the postcards, where they took some of the stuff that people told them and turned into postcards, kind of two-sided. The one side has some objection. Here you have an archaeologist standing with bones and saying, fair data, my data is already published in a research article. And then if you turn the card, there's a lady explaining you that fair data is much more than a description in a printed article. Fair data can be reused directly for new research projects. So there's these two sides. And there's a number of these different cards that you can find if you're interested. Going to the e-learning courses that were one of the main product, I would say, showing you from the first one. It has 3 different modules, one basic research data management, one FAIR principles, and one about data management plans. So that's a kind of a good, solid, fundamental introduction to the whole area of data management and FAIR. Turning then to the next generation, it was 2 hours training specifically on FAIR, covering this number of areas, covering documentation, how do you document your data, which file formats are good to use, metadata, access, persistent identifiers, and data licenses. So you will recognize both some of the things that Françoise liked and some of the things that she was not so happy about. And all the materials for this course are available through Zenodo, except the videos, but all the transcripts and all the graphic materials. So in principle, if you want to deploy it, and I thought I'd just play this 1-minute trailer to give you a taste. I hope the sound works, otherwise scream.
Okay, there's no sound yet, but maybe there's
no sound.
Oh, right, okay, yeah, we're not hearing Barron's. I think there's a thing when you're screen sharing in Zoom that you can click it to also share audio. So you might need to stop share and then try sharing again with that enabled.
All right, I forgot to enable. Should I do that? I
yeah, by all means, we've got plenty of time. So
okay, yeah, I forgot to.
I think it's an option that shows somewhere when you go to share screen.
Yeah, and I had done it earlier, then I had unshared. No, I don't. I just try to restart the thing, and we give it one more try, and then no more than that.
No, that's fine. But I think, I mean, just while you're setting that up, I think there's a really interesting range of resources there, you know, like things that can help generate discussion at events, like the postcards, that the things people may just pick up and it debunks those myths. And then, you know, like the online resources, the e-learning courses. And I was interested in the fairy tale. I think things like that help people understand the concepts really well. And I'd be interested, like, as we get to the discussion later, thinking about how that's being used, because I could imagine it in exercises, for example, giving people a story and saying, what is the principle that's being unpicked here? What is it that, you know, is the key thing we have to do, whether it's about identifiers or about metadata or whatever else? Because I think often the principles themselves can be quite dry, but I think that fairy tale is a good way to make that accessible to people. So do you want to try? We'll see if we can hear Baron.
I'm giving it. Yeah, I know. I mean, the fairy tale, I know the Go Fair people, or Baron Mons always flags it. That he has on his desk, and they said first when they saw it, oh no, another attempt. But then even Luis Bonino, the developer, liked it really a lot. I'll give it one try, and if it doesn't, it worked for me yesterday when I tested it, but if it doesn't work, we just skip it.
Okay.
Any luck?
Yet there's not any sound, but hang 1 second. No, we still don't hear Baron.
Okay.
Okay, we can watch that at our leisure.
You just watch it, and then
we can add the link. But I think, I mean, online learning, especially with the fact that we have this whole COVID situation just now, it's definitely a good way to try and help raise awareness of FAIR. So do you have another slide, or?
Yeah, I have a few more slides. We'll just skip.
Excellent.
Going to metadata for machines, we had these workshops with two groups, NRE and DG Wind Energy, which both interest in meteorological data, because we're moving away from saying the principal level and into this community process. What Françoise said, okay, you have to make your metadata machine actionable, but what does that mean? How do you do that? What does even metadata mean? That's not necessarily something the researchers understood, but they were very interested in this process because they think this is helping their research move forward. So we worked with GoFair together to establish this, and with some instructor from Stanford University that have developed a tool for metadata that combines metadata with vocabularies, and that's called CDAR, that can make something they call CDAR template. So it's a kind of web-based tool for making what is indeed can be complicated semantic relations. So we had 5 modules, most of them were 2 days, and we had to do it all over Zoom because of Corona. And the researchers had some consulting, and we had a lot of international observers actually interested in what is this kind of workshop. And both these groups had to make CDAR templates for the metadata. They had to make the necessary vocabularies defining the terms that they then use in the metadata if these vocabularies didn't exist. So that's also something that would really require the help from data stewards if you look at who should do this, because we don't think researchers should become experts necessarily in all this data related technicalities. And then each of them made a verification roadmap that you can find if you're interested on our website, how they are going to complete the process of making their metadata fair. So that's an example of how you could work with a specific research community on fulfilling their needs towards FAIR, what Françoise was talking about. And I'll just check how we're doing for time, that I'm not being too lengthy. No, I'm almost done. Finally, we have just published a draft strategy for how we are going to roll out FAIR in Denmark in much larger scale. The goal is from the ministry that newly produced research data must be made FAIR visible through EOSC in not very many years' time. They're not I'm not sure they totally understand what they are talking about, but they really mean that we have to be ambitious to start implementing FAIR across different disciplines. And the 6 principles, I won't run through them, but I would just mention that this has been done by a group of people from many different research institutions and from different disciplines. And they are sort of grouped around 3 main principles. One is, and probably maybe the most important, is that this is really a big cultural change that has to happen in research. And the advice that Françoise mentioned about the community focus very much echoes into this strategy. The second main area is the technical infrastructure. If the tools and the infrastructure is not there, it's unreasonable to ask the researchers to have to build it themselves. And third is what we call the knowledge infrastructure, the data stewards, and the whole organization to help and to go into the projects at appropriate level. So this is the strategy, and we hope that will result in an implementation plan sometimes next year. So finally, and this is again work that where DeiC has been is at the head of this. I've been head of one working group, and our board chair has been head of a working group regarding how to generate the funding. So this also associates with DeiC. Finally, I couldn't help, since this is an infrastructure context, to bring in a slide I made some years ago for Nordonet conference, trying to think what do you need in terms of infrastructure to support FAIR, and we took to think of this, we took a slide that Carol Goebel had made, where she tries to associate different kinds of infrastructure services with the FAIR principles. So if you look at what is required, we need all the fundamental services that we supply from DeiC. We need the network bandwidth, we need computing power, we need online storage, repositories, etc. And then we need more specific services. We need the data catalogs that Françoise was also mentioning. We need data repositories. We need resolvers for identifiers. We need federated AI services, so that we need to know who it is that is trying to access our services, or who it is that offers something. We need machine readable licenses, and we need published ontologies and vocabularies, just to mention some that come from this way of putting it. And indeed, we are also involved in DeiC in some of these. Currently, we are building a kind of service for vocabularies as a direct result of the metadata for machine workshop, because that was something the researchers asked. Say, we built this, but we want to make it public. Could you do this? We are also in DeiC, we are Danish consortium lead for DataCite for DOIs. So PIDs definitely is a big focus area for us. Data repositories is something we are likely to offer for some of this increased funding that we are going to receive from next year on. And so we're trying to play our role in this game. So this was my last slide.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Anders. It might be worth leaving that slide up, actually, because I have a comment about that. But yeah, there is a question in the chat already from Krista Loof, just really, I think, impressed with the level of work, because you're doing all of the core kind of NREN territory work, all of the networking HPC, but also all this research data management and FAIR support. So just to try and get a comparison, he's asking how many employees are working in total in DeiC, and how many are attributed directly to RDM services or to these FAIR initiatives.
So indeed, very few people are working directly in this RDM services. I don't know the total count for DeiC. It's probably 40 something or 50 something, and by way the most are working in the networking and service area. But we are 3.3 what do you say, FTM?
A full-time equivalent, FTE.
Full-time equivalents in data management. So this can only happen because we work very closely together with universities. In the earlier years, we had the data management forum that had 30 people from different universities, and we could provide some funding for them to make these small projects that produced all this cool stuff that you saw earlier on. The metadata for machine, we are going to fund. I hope I'm getting the next year's activities on the DeiC budget, but also there we work with, we really work with initially with researchers who are interested to try to develop a format that we can then offer more broadly, and then we'll have to work on a training program to train data stewards to be able to run these workshops. But we are a little group of 5 people who are doing the metadata for machine initiative. So it's not we're not a lot of people behind that, but there's this community around that's doing a lot.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, actually, that it's you don't have to deliver all of this yourself within the organization. You know, you can gain some momentum and traction and then leverage off the wider community. But also, I think the fact that you can offer funds to support work in other areas, that really helps to drive things. I was chatting this morning with a guy from Danish National Library actually around the data stewardship work they've been doing. So I think in everyone's national context, there's probably a lot of expertise already in universities or in different research groups or national libraries. And I think the NREN could be a really good locus to try and harness some of that and coordinate. And I think actually with DeiC, you also hosted the RDA, the Research Data Alliance node, and that had things like ambassador programs. So that's another way that you can essentially be this body that helps generate that community and get that wider work done. Excellent. So the question I wanted to pick up on, and if anyone else wants to ask questions, by all means put them in chat or raise a hand. Like, this is an open forum, so you can speak out as well. But I was struck with this slide where you're talking about the specific services, but also some of that earlier discussion around the data stewardship role and how through these metadata for machines workshops, you know, you're partnering with research communities, because both of these strike me as very cross-cutting things. They go beyond the national boundary. So work around data catalogs and PID resolvers, they're very kind of international initiatives. And also when we're trying to define standards or support communities to define their standards, that's something that's going to be, you know, much broader than the Danish research community. Those researchers are going to be collaborating internationally. And I wondered if you have any reflections on how we can maybe leverage the NREN network there, because I think that's one of the real strengths, that you are, you know, a global community, that certainly within Europe, within the GÉANT membership, you've got a national body in every country, and you probably already are collaborating when you're supporting certain initiatives like Copernicus research. You're already collaborating across the geographic boundaries. So maybe there's some ways where you do have shared interests, whether that be around, you know, the PID infrastructure, or around, you know, AAI or catalogs, or supporting certain research communities where that could work well and is potentially something we could try and help foster?
Yeah, I mean, mostly I'm not able how much I can answer this, but definitely some of the services are obviously already there, or already there partially. I mentioned here the EduGAIN service under AI. That's definitely the NREN part of DeiC taking care of. When we come to operating stuff in DeiC now, DeiC is a very virtual kind of organization, and most of the actual operations will be from now on put in different universities, but we still have the operations of the network and the services. So we're trying to balance this very very cautiously, because universities want to have the operation of the big infrastructure parts by different outsourced to them. So our role is to coordinate and to ensure this international dimension, what you mentioned. That's one of the things that, like I said, the FAIR strategy is the requirement is data should be visible through EOSC. Even we can hardly say what that means, but that's the vision the ministry has. So, and that is a lot the role they see we should take in this distributed landscape, that universities should be the executing parties. We should make sure we have enough knowledge, so we should be involved in sufficient activities that we can support them actively, and so we can ensure, and then we should be very much in the international field. Indeed, in some way in research, the national level doesn't really, if you ask universities, they say we're not interested in the national level, because we have ourselves and then we have our international research community. So the national level is a lot about coordinating and funding, as far as I can see it.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure I really answered your question.
No, I think that was a really good answer. And it actually echoes some things that had come out in the EIRG workshop yesterday about data infrastructures, because there was a presentation from Canada looking at the National Data Research Infrastructure Organization. They're new. It's in some ways it's an equivalent to EOSC. It's like the NDIRO, and the role of Canary there. And they were talking about, you know, the role of Canary in providing infrastructure, but actually that a lot of the delivery and the control and authority to define what it is that's needed and how it should be implemented has been put back in the hands of the institutions, because ultimately they are the users of the service and they are the ones who will end up paying the bill for it, because that's where the research is happening. And I thought that was a useful model for EOSC, because I think that governance of, you know, what's happening does kind of need to come back to the key stakeholders. So yeah, I think you're right about that collaboration with the universities as well. Françoise, you're raising a hand.
Yes, it's just to go back to the astronomy example. I am not sure it's applicable elsewhere, but just to tell you that we have the international body, the organization which is defining the standards with participation of all the people who want to participate. And we have something at the European level which is coordinating things around the European projects with no legal existence, but the people who are in it participate in European projects to bring the virtual observatory, for instance, in EOSC and so on in ESCAPE. And we have something at the national level, which is a place where the practitioners, the people who implement the standards, meet, and they can discuss about how to and so on. So I think that then the way these things are organized, it depends a lot on the national organization of research.
Yeah.
Because in our case, we get funds, a very small amount of funding, but it helps to make it work from the CNRS and from the Space Agency every year. And so people can meet, we pay travel of the people who play a recognized role in the IVOA to go there. So you can have also some support at the national level to enable people to implement things which come from the international level, and also to participate actively in the international level. So it can be done by thematic projects, but it can be also supported by money coming from more generic organizations if they think it's useful. So just to say that there are things which can be done, even if there is an international level, you can be in support somehow from inbound and outbound in a sense.
Yeah, no, exactly. That actually reminds me of a discussion I had with Anthony Beets when he was at Monash Research Centre, because they were supporting, different communities to develop their data platforms, and they were working with the open microscopy community, and there was a standard called Amero that had been adopted by that group. It had been defined by a group initially in Dundee, but they felt that their institutional funds were much better invested supporting them to develop that further, even though it wasn't, like the university solution. It was something that was the research communities. So that little bit of university funds went into advancing that solution more. And I think their justification was that it was more sustainable because it's what that community's adopted. So I think often, as Françoise said, there can be little bits of money from different sources. It might be a national fund. It might be something that, like the DeiC support for these different FAIR initiatives, and that just helps advance work on on an international level or a community level.
Yeah, certainly. We have been able to do this support, say paying for somebody for conference trips and all sort of little helps, and we're probably going to continue that. I should maybe also mention that it's not so clear and easy within DeiC how data management should be handled, as for instance with HPC. It's very clearly about clock cycles at building big computers and operating them and offering them to researchers in some organized way. Data management is defined. First, they are interested in storage. Still, the board is very focused on the hardware side. The universities are not very interested in cooperating, funnily enough, around data management infrastructure. But then in the overall strategy, it's also policies and practice. And personally, I'm particularly interested in the practice level. So this is not so easy for DeiC to handle these levels, which are not hardware oriented, which doesn't have a direct service endpoint and an operational life. So just that it's been there, and as long as we can do useful work, I really think that's the main thing. Justifies it being there. The moment we're not able to do it, so in my opinion, that also calls for some kind of, I'd almost say, national leadership, even if that is nowhere part of an official remit. That's really required to be useful enough to the community.
And I think there are good examples of that. So like the Danish National Data Management Forum you had, or in Ireland, for example, they've got the National Open Research Forum that's now employed like a open science coordinator. And I think it can often be hard for people to grasp those kind of intangible aspects, the policy and practice side, like you said. I remember reviewing a proposal once, and one of the people criticized it because it didn't talk about technical infrastructure. It was all about the human infrastructure and the softer sides about actual people's practices and the cultural change. But I think that's just as important as all of the hardware and kit, and it can be harder, it can be a bit more nebulous to define, but you won't get the cultural change and the actual adoption of open science or fair practices without investing in that side as well. So it might not be core NREN business, and it might be quite a scary area to move into, but like you say, I think it's quite an important leadership role.
I think for us, we currently, apart from doing the strategy business that we have been assigned from the ministry, we're focusing most on the data stewardship side of things. So the metadata for machines are our main strategic move for the next years to strengthen that side of things and to start to demonstrate that FAIR is not just fluffy concepts, but it takes real work to get there. And what is that real work? How can we also, by trying these processes, how can we distillate down to, or condensate into something that's very manageable for just a normal research team, because this strategy calls for a big rollout, so we cannot have some very, very complicated processes for every research team who wants to travel that path. We have to be able to find a very smooth way of working. So that's really, and some easy, well-functioning tooling. So that's really what we hope to do next year.
Yeah, and I think there are aspects of FAIR that are quite generic around things like the identifiers and making metadata harvestable, which, you know, is more kind of core and NREN work. And we got a good example of, you know, applying it in astronomy earlier from Françoise, which I think helps make it a bit more concrete for the audience.
And then we make ourselves available to host these things, what they produce. Like we're hosting these e-learning websites, we're hosting DMP online, we're hosting when they come and say we need some websites for our ontologies and stuff, then that's where we put our technical capability in at a modest scale.
One of the things which could be interesting as at the national level, it's more on the policy level, but if you have a portal, just maybe not a portal, but a list of data repositories from the country, maybe it's something which can interest the authorities to be able to show that they have things which go into the open science game, because there are data repositories which are open and so on. So I don't know. It's not so much for people to find the resources, because there are things elsewhere which allow to find the resources, but to be able to show what is done at the national level. If you have a general list of data repositories which have a certain level of sustainability and quality, it could be interesting for your authorities. I don't know.
Yeah, to make the case. Yeah, definitely. So just before we close, I wanted to check if anyone has any other questions they'd like to raise or any comments about the session. I don't see anything coming in. So I would like to just take the time just to thank Anders and Françoise. I think that's been very useful. There have actually been a number of comments in chat, some personal to me as well, just thanking for the presentations because they've been really illuminating. And also questions around how the content will be available. So just to clarify for everybody, the slides are already on the wiki. This session has been recorded. So after the session, I think Magda will probably crop off the start where we were just chatting, and then the video will become available on the GÉANT wiki as well. So if you want to share this with colleagues, or if there's anything you want to get a refresher on, by all means review that content again. There was one question I was going to ask Anders just before we close. The content that came out of your work, so the e-learning materials and the postcards and fairy tale, are they all openly licensed if people wanted to reuse? Or
yes, they are. All that postcards and all the stuff is CC something, and all the stuff from the, probably not the videos in the e-learning, they're probably somehow protected, but I know the transcriptions are in Zenodo, and all the images from these are in Zenodo, and it's all CC licensed.
Excellent. So if people are wanting to get involved in FAIR, or raising awareness of it, there's already through these groups, but also elsewhere, you'll find a lot of useful resources. And if you need any other pointers, by all means, come back to us at GÉANT, and I can direct questions elsewhere if we need specific expertise from like the DeiC example, or from astronomy, or from other communities. So thank you all very much for attending today. Thank you particularly to Françoise and Anders for giving up the time to speak.
Thank you.
And I think we have these sessions every month. So there will be one in January on research data management, in which we'll be looking at the UDAT suite of services. So if we don't see you before then, have a fantastic Christmas and New Year. Hopefully, we won't all get to travel, but hopefully you can still have a nice rest. Yeah, see you all soon.